Okay, we're moving on from swans. We're going to talk about geese for a minute. Snow goose and Ross's goose are two birds that look very similar. They're both white. They have black in the wings. You can't see the black on the snow goose in the wings just because of the way it's holding its wings in this picture. There's a blue phase of the snow goose. There's also a blue phase of the Ross's goose. So you can have the white phase or the blue phase. But the way you tell them apart really doesn't matter so much as to which phase it is. The snow geese are bigger than the Ross's geese. So if you see a flock of snow geese flying over, and you see some that are smaller, you can actually pick out Ross's geese in a flying flock. And there are a lot of people, who do that. They'll look, they'll pick through the flocks as they fly by and look for the Ross's geese. So that's one way to tell them apart. But if they're sitting on the water like this, obviously, if they're together, you can see that one is bigger than the other, but they're not very often seen together. So the things you want to look for, again, just like the swans, the head shape is different. The snow goose has a flatter head. The Ross's goose has a rounder head. And then the real differences, though, are in the bill. And this is a close-up, a little bit closer view of the photos we just looked at. And you can see that the snow goose has that black area between the upper and lower mandibles, the lower and upper part of the bills where they come together. That's called a grinning patch. And the Ross's goose doesn't have that. It has some gray, bluish gray, like bumps on its bill up closer to the face. And you'll also notice that the Ross's goose has a shorter, stubbier bill, and the snow goose has a bigger bill. And of course, that big black patch makes it look even bigger than it is. We're going to talk a little bit. This is one of my detours from our identification. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with the snow goose population. Believe it or not, where I live in eastern Minnesota, snow geese are pretty rare. I've only ever seen one snow goose anywhere in Minnesota, and it was in the southwest part of the state. And in eastern Minnesota, where I live, if a snow goose or a Ross's goose is found, and even a white-fronted goose, that's a reportable event. They get reported on the rare bird line. We don't get the huge tornadoes of tens of thousands of birds like you see in the Rainwater Basin or at DeSoto or down at Les Bluffs along the Missouri River or in the Central Flyway. But anyway, that being said, what we're going to talk about is a little bit about why it is that you're seeing so many snow geese in the spring and the fall and the winter in Nebraska. So there are 3 or 4, depending on what literature you read, different populations of snow geese. They're all the same species. They're all snow geese. But there's one in the east that's called the Atlantic population. There's one in the Midwest that's called the Mid-Continent, which is the one that we see in Nebraska. And then there's either, depending on how you count them, 1 or 2 populations in the West. So don't be concerned about, those the hatches and the cross hatches and the different shades of gray on this graph. What I just want you to pay attention to is, if you look at the beginning of the graph, which is the mid-1970s, and the end of the graph, which is 2008, you'll see what the population of snow geese has been doing. And it's estimated, I couldn't find more recent data than this, but the data that I did find says that the population increases about 5% per year. So if you extrapolate that out, that means that just the mid-continent flyway population is probably about 8 million now. It was 5 million in 2008, and now 12 years later, it would be probably approaching 8 million. And likewise, the Atlantic flyway population is on the same kind of a curve. It would probably be at about 2.2 million now. So the question is, why is this happening? Why the population explosion, and why does it matter? So there are several things that are contributing to the population explosion. One is that hunting laws were restricted in the 1970s and 80s. And also during that time, as you probably remember, some of the predatory birds like the bald eagle that does prey on some number of waterfowl was very endangered and threatened, and very low population. We have a lot more agriculture now than we had in the past, and the agriculture is more efficient and more productive. But it also, because there's more of it, there's more food available. And then the other thing that's happened is, for those of you who go out birding like I do, we often visit waterfowl production areas and wildlife management areas, which are wonderful places. There's a lot of conservation organizations that are doing great things, but it is creating more habitat for these birds to thrive during migration and during the winter. And it's not just the snow geese that are experiencing this kind of population and explosion. As you know, if you've ever driven around town, you can find Canada geese nesting in pretty much every puddle, even in the city. So why is this a problem? Well, this is a shot of what the snow geese breeding grounds look like, and they breed up in the tundra, you know, up in the Arctic, a long way north from here. And you can see that by anybody's estimation, that's overcrowding. I mean, there's pretty hard to imagine any more, you know, amount of birds in an area that size trying to nest. And again, they're on the tundra. And what this picture shows, just like we used to have deer exclosures in Fontenelle Forest to see what the forest would look like if the deer weren't browsing, that little crooked, broken down looking white fence is a goose exclosure. And inside the fence is what the tundra is supposed to look like. And outside of the tundra, or outside of the fence, is what the tundra is looking like where the snow geese are nesting. So the problem that's happening here is that because of the overpopulation and because of the extreme sensitivity of the habitat where they breed, they're destroying their own habitat because of the overpopulation. So when I back up. When I use these slides, or when I used to use these slides with middle school and high school students in the environmental education programs that I was doing, one of the things we always talked about is how people in general, humans, really ruin the environment when they mess with it. And even though, as I said, there are great conservation organizations who are creating these habitats that are wonderful overwintering spots for so many species, in this particular case, it is really contributing to the overpopulation and the problem with the geese. So, you know, even the best plans and the best executed conservation measures can have some negative impacts. So that's that. We'll move on a little bit now. Canada and cackling geese are two geese that people that are fairly common and people see, but I think that sometimes my opinion is that sometimes cackling geese get misidentified. So that's why I wanted to spend a little time talking about this. Cackling geese used to be just a subspecies of Canada goose. So 15, 20 years ago, however long ago it was, there were like, I think 15 or so species of Canada geese, and it included 3 subspecies that were small and were referred to as the cackling subspecies of the Canada geese. And then some years ago, they got split. They decided that the cackling goose was actually, you know, genetically separate from the Canada goose. So now there are probably a dozen or so subspecies of Canada goose, and then there are 3 subspecies of cackling geese. And what you'll see here, there's a Canada goose here and a cackling goose in this photo. And what you'll see is that the cackling goose is much smaller. It has kind of a squarish head where the Canada goose has kind of a roundish head. And the cackling goose has a really short, stubby bill. But one of the problems, one of the pitfalls with identifying cackling geese is there's also a lot of variation in the size of the different subspecies of the Canada geese. So you can have a flock of Canada geese that has, you know, greater and intermediary and lesser subspecies mixed in with it. And you can be tempted to say, oh, there's a small Canada looking goose, it must be a cackling goose. And so rather than trying to compare cackling geese with Canada geese, what I prefer to do is try to compare them with a nearby duck. Because as you see in this picture, a cackling goose is sitting in the water is looks no bigger than a mallard. And I think that's, if you're trying to do a size comparison to find your cackling goose, look for that first, and then look for the other characteristics like the head shape and the bill. Now, a cackling goose weighs considerably more than a mallard. It is a bigger bird. It's a heftier bird because it has a great big belly underneath, but it's not really any longer than a mallard. And so when they're sitting in the water, they look like they're about the same size. Okay, we're going to leave the geese and duck, or the swans and geese, and move into the ducks. Anybody got any questions at all? If you do, let us know. Okay. So these are some ducks that a few years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, wouldn't even have been in this presentation because they just weren't found in Nebraska or certainly in Minnesota. And these are the whistling ducks. They're much more common farther south. You can see both of these ducks pretty easily in Texas, for example. but they've been making their way northward. There were black-bellied whistling ducks in Lake Manawa, I know, in 2019. And there were some there. I lived in some apartments by Charlie's on the Lake even a few years before that, on a 144th and F, and there was a black-bellied whistling duck in the pond at that apartment complex several years ago. And then the fulvous whistling ducks on the right, I believe Phil photographed those near Lincoln in 2018. And a lot of people went down to Lancaster County and saw those and got those as a state bird. So the differences between the two are pretty obvious. I mean, the bill color is very different. The black-bellied has the orange bill, and the fulvous has a black bill, almost kind of looks like a pintail. And the black-bellied whistling duck, the body is much more strikingly colored with the white stripe and the black belly. The fulvous whistling duck does have some white feathers, though. It has like some white plumes on the side of the body that are pretty noticeable when you see this bird. So this isn't one you can go out and look for anywhere, but it's one you definitely want to keep an eye out for because they're both starting to extend their range farther north with climate change. Okay, so now I want to take another diversion from our identification portion of the program, and I want to talk a little bit about duck molt. And the reason I put this in here is because the process that ducks use for molting is different from most of the other birds that we see. And also, I recently attended a webinar that was conducted by Peter Pyle, who is one of the foremost worldwide experts on bird molt. And I learned some cool stuff, so I thought I would share it with you. So the first thing we need to talk about a little bit is what is molt. And basically, molt is just the replacement of feathers in birds. There are several reasons why birds molt. Sometimes birds lose feathers that they aren't unexpectedly. So they might be attacked by a predator, or they might be sick, or they might have an accident, or just from stress. Occasionally when we capture birds, when we're bird banding, they'll drop a few feathers. And so birds have the ability to replace those feathers as they need to, and that's called adventitious molt. And then just as people, need to change clothes because our clothes get worn and dirty, birds need to replace their feathers. And most North American bird species replace all of their feathers once a year. And there are some types of molt that are for changing color for various reasons. So some species undergo molts to add color. So like, for example, the American goldfinch, the males look yellow in the spring and summer and not in the winter, presumably to attract a mate. And then there are some species that actually molt to remove color. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So want to talk about the terms basic and alternate plumage a little bit, because those are key terms to understand when you're looking at birds and when you're talking about molt and when you're understanding the things we're talking about tonight. So basic plumage is a term that refers to the feathers that adult birds wear most of the time. Okay, so for many of the birds that we see day to day, like woodpeckers, chickadees, nuthatches, sparrows, wrens, vireos, even some of the warblers, their basic plumage is just the plumage that they have all year. I mean, a downy woodpecker molts in the fall. It looks the same before and after the molt, other than the fact that the feathers are just newer and fresher. It doesn't really look any different. So, and when these birds molt, they just replace a few feathers at a time. So they're still able to fly. They're still able to do all the things that they need to do to survive. And so the molt is just a kind of an ongoing process for a period of weeks while they're changing into their new feathers. In addition to this, and this molt usually for most of the birds that we see occurs in the late summer or the early fall. So all of the birds that come to your feeders, all the birds that migrate through here, they're doing this molt, this pre-basic molt in the late summer or the early fall. Then some birds do a second molt, usually in the spring. And in this case, these birds actually change their body plumage and they look different. And the plumage that they're changing into is called alternate plumage. So the basic plumage is the one they hold most of the time. The alternate plumage is a temporary plumage. And as we mentioned with the goldfinch, they'll hold that plumage for maybe 3 or 4 or maybe 5 months to get them through the breeding season. And so here are a couple of examples. So this is a scarlet tanager, the bird on the left. This is a bird that I photographed in our yard last October. It was here for several weeks in the fall, which was kind of unusual. What we know about this bird is that it is an adult. It was not hatched the year that this photograph was taken, because otherwise it would not have any red on it at all, because young scarlet tanagers don't get their red until the next spring. And adult scarlet tanagers that are red all summer, they do a complete molt in the fall. They molt all of their wing feathers, all their tail feathers, all their body feathers, and they change from red to green. So if you see a scarlet tanager in South America in the winter, it's not going to be red, it's going to be green. So what we can see is that this bird is losing its red feathers and it's replacing it with some green feathers. So it's losing color with its basic plumage, presumably for camouflage during the non-breeding season. On the right is the bird on the front of the feeder that you can see, actually probably both of them, is a adult male American goldfinch. This is one I photographed in my yard in Omaha when we still lived in Omaha. This one is doing its pre-alternate molt. The tanager is doing a pre-basic molt to get into basic plumage. This bird is doing a pre-alternate molt to get into alternate plumage. So it's changing from brown to yellow. And as we talked about, it's doing that so that it'll be all bright yellow in the breeding season, and will hopefully attract a mate. It's also interesting to note that female goldfinches also do this same kind of a molt in the spring, but then they don't look any different. So they molt their body feathers, not their wing and tail feathers, not their flight feathers, but the males and the females both do a body molt. They both get new feathers. The male looks completely different. He's in alternate plumage. The female's in alternate plumage, but you can't tell the difference. Okay. So what you have here is you have an example of a bird that adds color with their pre-alternate molt, and you have a bird that removes the goldfinch, and you have a bird that removes color with its pre-basic molt. That's the tanager. Okay, so who cares, right? So the thing that's interesting about this, and the reason we're talking about it, is because ducks do something completely different. Most ducks. Ducks do kind of the opposite thing with their body molt. So between July and September of each year, most North American duck species will do a complete molt, just like all the other birds we talked about, just like the tanager. They'll do a complete molt, all their wing feathers, all their body feathers, all their tail feathers. But the thing that's different is they do it all at once. They don't have it spread out over as protracted a period. So there's actually a period of time when they can't fly. So if you're looking at waterfowl late in the summer or early in the fall, sometimes you'll come up on like a flock of ducks in the water, and you'll spook them, and they'll just go skittering across the water into the weeds or into the reeds. And that's because if they're molting, they may not be able to fly. So what happens with their body molt is they remove color, sort of like we talked about with the tanager, but they only, and so they go into like a drab camouflaged body molt, body plumage, and this is what's called eclipse plumage. So while the bird is doing its molt, and while it's not able to fly, it goes into a camouflage kind of a plumage that's called eclipse plumage, and this is the alternate plumage for these ducks. So when we talked about alternate plumage for the tanager and the goldfinch, it was bright colored. But when we talk about alternate plumage for the ducks, it's dull colored. And they only wear this plumage for a short time. When their wing feathers and their tail feathers are about halfway molted in, the new ones, then they'll start to do their body molt back into their bright color like we usually see them. And so that's why when you see like a mallard or a wood duck or a redhead or whatever in the winter, it's a bright plumage bird. That's its basic plumage. That's the plumage it wears most of the time. And its alternate plumage is this kind of drab looking eclipse plumage. And the reason all of that is really, other than just interesting information, at least to me, is that when you're looking at ducks in the late summer and the early fall, they don't look like what they normally look like in the field guides, and they're much more difficult to identify. So during that period of time, don't look at ducks, go out and look at other birds. Okay, back to identification. I photographed these wood ducks up here in the spring of 2020, and there really probably isn't anything that you would mistake a wood duck for. I mean, they don't really look like any other duck, but I think that they're one of the most beautiful birds in the world. And that's why I put them in here, just because I think they're so cool. So wood ducks, common ducks, they are cavity nesters, as most of you know. If you put up a house, a large bird house in your yard, if you live anywhere near water, you can get wood ducks to nest in a box sometimes. And the hen is not as, of course, strikingly colored and patterned as the drakes are, But that good field mark for the hen wood duck is that big white area around her eye. Okay, so the good news is we are about halfway through the slides. Hope everybody's still awake. And all the other good news is that the second half of the slides go faster than the first half because I'm not taking as many side roads. So moving along. This is a identification problem that causes some people quite a bit of grief, the difference between the mallard and the American black duck. So you would not mistake a Drake mallard for an American black duck because the Drake mallard has the green head and the reddish brown breast. But the hen mallard, the female, can easily be mistaken for an American black duck. So the things you want to look for here, the other thing you need to be aware of, almost these days, almost any time I see black ducks, there may be one or two pure black ducks, but there will almost always be some hybrids too, because black ducks used to be the most common duck on the eastern part of the United States. It was like they were the mallard of the East. They were the really common duck that you saw everywhere. But again, because of issues we talked about before with changes in habitat and changes in bird populations, the mallards are more aggressive. They've spread east over time more so than ever before, and they're out competing and they're crossbreeding with the black ducks, and they're like changing the DNA of that species. And it may be someday that there may not be any more American black ducks. I don't know, but they're certainly not as common as they used to be. But they are still around. They show up occasionally in Nebraska. They're a little more common here than they are in Nebraska. But the things you want to look at on these birds, first of all, if you look at the speculum of the mallard, and that's the blue feathers in the wing, the secondary feathers that in many duck species have bright colors, is called the speculum. I think it's the Latin word for mirror. If you look at the speculum on the mallard, it's got a white border on the top of it and the bottom of it. So it's blue surrounded by white. If you look at the black duck, all you can see is just a little hint of white at the tips of those feathers. And this is a really beautiful photo because usually in the field, you wouldn't even see that. So when you see the American black duck, you won't notice white around the speculum. But I think the better field marks, and the ones that you can see more readily if the duck, for example, doesn't have its wing spread, has to do with the body feathers. So if you look at the mallard on the left, it's the body feathers are like multicolored, stripy, streaky, dark brown, light brown. They've got the light brown streaks going through the feathers. Where if you look at the black duck, those body feathers are all dark and they have just a pale fringe. So if you look closely at those body feathers, you can see that there's a pretty key difference there. And that is why the black duck is called the black duck, because of those really dark body feathers. And what you'll find if you have a duck that's a hybrid is you'll see kind of a mix of those feathers or something that looks not exactly like either one. And that's a good indication that you have a hybrid. The other thing to notice, and I'll go back to the other slide, and we'll look at this on both slides, is the color of the bill. The American black duck, a pure American black duck, doesn't ever have any real orange in the bill, where the mallard does have some or a lot of orange. You can see that on this hen. You can also see the orange in this photo on the bird on the left. On the right, you'll see that the adult Drake black duck does have a yellow bill, but not orange. And then the bird in front is either an immature bird or a female with a grayish bill. Okay. Gadwall is a really common duck that you'll often see in the same kind of habitat where you see mallards. Mallards and gadwalls are dabbling ducks. That means they don't dive under the water. They just kind of eat vegetation that they find on the surface, or like we saw with the ducks with their tails up in the air, they're reaching down into the water for vegetation. So a gadwall is a really plain bird, and you see them in all really different shades of brown. At least that's been my experience. I think depending on whether they're drakes or hens or how old they are or what the light is like, the brown on the body can be quite variable, but they all have that black back end. So if you look about 3/4 of the way back on the side of the bird, from there all the way back to the back of the bird, it's black. And that's a really good field mark. The other thing that's a really good field mark on this bird is the white speculum. And in the bird that's in flight on the right, you can see that. You can see the white patch in that same area of the wing that we talked about. Sometimes you can see that on the bird, depending on how it's holding its wing. Sometimes you can see that on a bird sitting in the water. But if you see a bird that has a duck that has a white speculum like that, it's pretty good chance that it's a Gadwall. But you have to be careful because there are other birds, there are other ducks that have white in their wing, but it's not in that area. It's on the front of the wings, and a widgeon, the American widgeon and the Eurasian widgeon is a bird that has white in its wing, but it's not in the speculum. And just in the interest of time and space, I couldn't include photos of everything, but you can see on the bird on the left, the American widgeon, that you can see a little bit of that white up at the very front of the wing. So if that bird were in flight, you would see a lot of white in the wing, but it's not in the speculum. It's up on the front of the wing, on the leading edge of the wing. So Eurasian widgeon is a bird that is really rare in the U.S., but it does show up from time to time. They're reported in the rainwater basin. There have been 2 of them reported here where I live just since I've lived here in the last couple of years. So it's worth noting. It's worth being aware of. They both have the really pale stripe on the head, but you'll see after that, once you look at the rest of the body, that they're really quite different. The American widgeon has the green, or sometimes you don't see the green depending on the light, but it at least looks dark. Below that pale stripe, it has dark on the top of its head, through its eye, and down the back of its head. And then it's got kind of a pinkish brown, reddish brown body overall, where the Eurasian widgeon, which you can see the bird on the far right in the right photo, has that same pale stripe, but its head is all a rich reddish brown, and it's got a pinkish breast and a gray body. So it looks very different. And the reason I included this photo, a couple reasons, and this was a photo I took in Albany, Minnesota last year. There's a Eurasian widgeon with an American widgeon there, so you can kind of see the difference and the contrast. And the other thing is, a lot of these photos that we're looking at, like the one on the left, is a beautiful photo, but when you're out birding, you're usually not that close to the bird. So I tried to have some photos in here that are more, what you're really going to see, because you're not going to be right on top of the bird. But I do, just to save the day, Phil Swanson did send me an absolutely gorgeous photo of a Eurasian widgeon, and you can see how just incredibly beautiful that bird is up close. It's a really cool bird.
That was in Vancouver, Canada, where I got that one.
Vancouver?
Yep.
Vancouver, yep. Canada. There you go.
Not Minnesota or Nebraska.
Have you seen him in Nebraska before, Phil?
Just this year earlier. Mary and I.
Oh, right. Yep.
And they were at McConaughey, or Ogallala, I should say.
Cool. Yeah, they're really beautiful. The one I photographed here last year was only the second one I'd ever seen. First one was in California. Okay, northern pintail. The sort of like we talked about with the mallard, you're not going to mistake a Drake pintail for much of anything. It just has that really beautiful, elegant, almost looks like it's wearing a tuxedo with its plumage. It's just really a beautiful bird. But the hen and the immature birds are, they don't look very much like the Drake at all. And the field marks I look for here are just that overall plain brown head and a pretty heavy all black bill. And then they do have, I mean, depending on what you think is beautiful, I think they have a really beautiful pattern, just the way those dark brown feathers have all that white edging on it. I think it just makes a really, even though it's not colorful, I just think it's a really beautiful, beautiful pattern. And it's really distinct. That brown and white pattern is pretty different from most of the other, any of the other ducks, really. Okay, green wing and blue wing teal. This is always kind of an interesting discussion, I think, because the green wing teal is named for that green speculum that it has. And if you look at the blue wing teal in the photo on the right, you'll notice that they too have a green speculum. All teal have green specula. So the fact that one is named green wing teal because of that is kind of confusing, I think, or kind of misleading. But you will notice that the blue on the blue wing teal is not in the same spot. It's up on in the lesser coverts. It's up in the leading edge of the wing. So it has the blue lesser coverts and median white median coverts, and then it's got the green secondaries. So I don't think you would probably mistake them for each other. The drakes, the head patterns and colors are completely different. They really don't look that much alike. But the word of caution here is just to know that just because you happen to see green in the wing doesn't mean you've got a green wing teal. And I have birded with people who have said, oh, look, you know, and especially if it's a female teal, because green wing and blue wing females look pretty much exactly alike until they spread their wings. And I've had people say, oh, look, you know, it's a green wing teal because it's got the green speculum, but then, you know, the bird takes off and it's also got the big blue patch. So my rule about that is unless the female teal has her wings spread out or unless she's with a male, I don't even try to identify the females anymore. So. And just to keep things continually confusing, blue wing teal is not the only duck that has blue on that part of its wing. And I didn't really realize until I was looking at this incredible photo on the right from Phil, if I go back to the blue wing teal, you can see where it's got the blue on the front of the wing and the green speculum and the rest of it is brown. And if you look at the shoveler basically has the same wing. It's the same color and pattern exactly, which I think is kind of crazy. The best field, I mean, you're probably not going to mistake a shoveler for anything else because of the bill. And that's the best thing, really. I think the best field mark for the shoveler overall is that huge, heavy bill. And that is what the bird is named for. Sometimes you might be a little bit confused about the green head and, you know, do I have a mallard, you know, a drake mallard? But remember that the mallard has the reddish breast and then the white belly, where the northern shoveler is flip-flopped. It has the white breast and the reddish belly. And again, you know, a ridiculously large bill, and its bill is black where a mallard's is orange. So, okay, female mergansers. So if all of the mergansers looked as clean and beautiful and bright as these two, it wouldn't be any issue at all. But unfortunately, usually when you're looking at mergansers, they're going underwater, coming back up, going under, coming up. They're all wet. Their feathers are all matted down. They're, you know, 100 miles out from where you're standing and you're peering through a scope. The best field mark, I think, for the female mergansers is the little white chin on the common merganser. That usually, regardless of the rest of the condition of the bird and the lighting conditions, you can usually notice that distinct white patch on the female common merganser. And that's a really good field mark. And then the red-breasted merganser, you know, lacks that. And like, again, if you have a really nice view and perfect light like this, it's not too tough. And if you're able to get a really close view of these birds, like through a scope, or if you get a really good photo like these two, there are also some distinct but subtle differences between, is that an oxymoron? Distinct but subtle? There are some differences in the bill. So first of all, if you look at the red-breasted merganser on the right, you will notice that the bill is really, really thin. It just doesn't widen out as it comes up to the head the same way that the common merganser does. And sometimes they look even thinner than the one pictured, and sometimes they almost look like they even curve up a little bit. I saw one up in Duluth about a week ago that was like, almost looked like the bill curved up. They have a really, really thin bill. And then the other thing you might notice if you look really super close is on the red-breasted merganser, there are like three points that come back from the bill back into the head. So like right at the top of the bill, there's like an angle, there's a V, and then where the two, I'm pointing to the picture, where the two mandibles come together, there's a point, and then down right below that, right above the chin, there's a point. Where if you look at the common merganser, there's really only two places where the bill points back into the head. And the other thing is there's just a really subtle difference in the shape of the face where it meets up with the upper mandible. On the red-breasted merganser on the right, there's kind of an angle there where the bill meets the feathers of the head. And on the common merganser, it's more like a C shape. It's more rounded. So there are some, yep, Bob's putting his glasses on. If you get a good look at the heads, there are some differences there. That red-breasted merganser on the right is a drake, by the way. It's not a hen. It's not a female, but it's a really good illustration of what their bill looks like. Okay, moving on. These are two birds that I think a lot of people think they're difficult to differentiate, maybe because they're colored somewhat the same, but they're really very distinct, even though they share a common color scheme. The canvasback on the right is almost always bright white. I mean, when you're looking out, even in bad light, when you look out at ducks out on the water, if there's a canvasback in there, that white on the back just jumps out at you. The redhead is grayer. Like we talked about with the swans and the snow geese, they also have a difference in their head shape. The canvasback has a really flat profile in the way the bill leads into the head, where the redhead has more of a rounded head with a curved bill. And the canvasback's bill is all black, and the redhead has a multicolored bill. And that's true of both the drakes and the hens. So these birds are often seen together, but really, even though they both have reddish heads and black breasts, they're not that hard to tell apart. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about lesser scaup and greater scaup. Lesser scaup are way more common than greater scaup. So when you see a scaup, your first thought is always, why would it not be a lesser? I mean, it's always kind of assumed that it's probably going to be a lesser. And traditionally, what the field guides have shown and what people have looked at is the shape of the head to differentiate these two birds. So the theory is that if the highest point of the head, the peak of the head is behind the eye on the back of the head, like it is on the bird on the left, then you've got a lesser scaup. So in other words, a lesser scaup sort of looks like it has a crest, or that the highest point of its head is behind the eye. Where on the greater scaup, the highest point will either be in front of the eye or directly over it. So the idea here is that the peak of the bird's head is towards the front of the head, and then it slopes down behind that. And then the other thing that people sometimes look at, is the greater scaup does have a noticeably larger bill, and it has a big black knob on the end of it, where the lesser scaup sometimes has a knob and sometimes doesn't. But since I've been birding up here with the people in Minnesota, one of the things I've learned is that these days, all the cool kids are using a completely different way to tell the scaup apart. They're looking at the side of the bird, the flanks. So not the gray back, but the palest area on the bird all along the side of the bird. And if you look at the lesser scaup on the left, you will see that those birds have kind of a dirty, dingy, grayish brown wash on that pale side of their body, where the greater scaup on the right is all bright white. Doesn't have any like smudgy grayish brown feathers in it. And that's the thing that because I posted a picture of a bird that I thought was a greater scaup, and everybody came back and chastised me and said no, that it's too despite the shape of the head, it's too it's not white enough on the sides. So so you got to be careful with the head shape thing, because these are diving ducks, and so they go underwater and they come up and they're wet, and birds have the ability to move those feathers. They can raise and lower them. So the head shape thing is kind of losing ground to the color of the flanks. And the other thing that Phil's picture shows here that is really important to note is that even though the birds that sometimes when they're illustrated in the field guides, the greater scaup has kind of a purplish head and the lesser scaup has kind of a greenish head, that's pretty much useless, because both of those birds in the picture on the left are lesser scaup, and you can see that the head color is completely different. I mean, that's totally a reflection of whatever the light is. So don't rely on head color. Don't use head color at all in trying to differentiate the scaup. Okay, everybody still awake? Okay, we're getting close. Ring-necked duck, I think probably should be called ring-billed duck more than ring-necked duck. If you look at the birds on the left, especially, you can really see the variation in the different colors in the bill and the different patterns in the bill and the white rings around the bill. The reason it's called ring-necked duck is that the drakes have like this little tiny, very narrow purplish band around the base of their neck, right where their neck meets the body. And I think in all of my life, I think I've seen that once in the field. It's just almost unnoticeable. Hunters must have named these birds, you know, because I suppose when you killed one and you got it in your hand, you can see it. But anyway, that is why it's called ring-necked duck, because it does have this little tiny purple ring around its neck. But probably the best field mark that the birds you're most likely going to confuse the ring-necked duck with are the scaups, because if you look, they're, you know, they have dark heads and pale bodies. So the best field mark really, if they're in basic plumage like this, is right where the black of the breast meets the white of the side of the body. There's like a little point that goes up, and there's like a little vertical white bar right there that comes to a point. And the scaup, as you'll see when I go back, the scaup doesn't have that. You can see that the scaup just doesn't have that little white crescent that sticks up, but it's like a little swoop that's pretty noticeable. Now the hen ring-necked duck is kind of it can be kind of confusing, and I didn't put the female scaup in here just again because of time and space, and you know, you can only talk about so many things, but the female scaup are the ones that you might confuse with the female ring-necked duck. The female scaup are all brown, except they have right around the base of the bill, they have this like bright white patch. Now the hen on the right, the photo that I took, this was a Christmas bird count photo. I took this photo over by Pacific Junction, Iowa. You can see that it doesn't look very much like the hen on the picture on the left. And I would guess that this bird maybe maybe it's an immature bird, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it hadn't completed its molt yet, but they're both female ring-necked ducks. And if you look really closely at the picture on the right, you can see that it does have a little thin white stripe across the bill, and it does have a little hint of a white eye ring. But the other thing you'll notice is that even though most of the head is dark brown, it kind of fades into a paler color all around the bill and down into the throat and down into the down into the neck, where a scaup would just be all brown except for just the white patch around the bill. So two hen ring-necked ducks that don't look very much alike. Okay, goldeneyes. As the name suggests, the common goldeneye is the one that's way more common in our area, in Nebraska and Minnesota. These are winter birds that you're going to see during the winter. The thing that most people focus on is the white patch to tell the common goldeneye from the Barrow's goldeneye. Barrow's goldeneye is very rare here. It's a bird of the west. You can find them breeding, in Colorado and places west of that. And a lot of people kind of focus on that white patch. And, these are two really excellent photos, not surprising since they're from Phil. And you can see the difference in the shape of the white patch. But oddly enough, believe it or not, depending on the light and depending on the bird itself and how much the waves are going up and down, sometimes, you can't get a 100% clear view of that white patch as much as you'd like to. So the other thing to look at on these birds is the body. And what you'll notice is that the common goldeneye, other than that black stripe across the very top of the back, most of the body is white with just a few little black marks, black feathers in it. Where if you look at the Barrow's goldeneye, the body is mostly black and it's got white spots. It's got white, almost like a little row of white squares right through that black. So the combination of that face pattern and the body pattern is what you look at to differentiate these two. Okay, and I think this is our last one. I hope so, because I probably won't know what to say if there are more. The reason I put the Ruddy Duck in is not because I think you would necessarily have difficulty identifying it, but because it's an exception to the molt plan that we talked about. The Ruddy Duck does not do the eclipse plumage like the other ducks that we talked about. The picture on the left is a Drake Ruddy Duck, and this is what they look like from late spring all the way through summer. They actually have a pretty impressive breeding plumage where the body is all reddish brown, and they have that bright blue. That's just crazy how their bill turns blue like that. And I have seen some that just almost look like they're lit up, like they're neon. So what this bird does is in the late summer or the fall, it does a molt, a pre-basic molt that's more similar to what we talked about with the scarlet tanager, and it turns into a much drabber version of itself. And the bird in the right photo, the bird on the left is a male in basic plumage. And you can see it still has this pretty much the same head pattern. It's got the big white cheek and the dark head. And this photo was taken, I think Phil told me he took this in April. So what you can see is it does have a few of the reddish brown feathers that are starting to come in. So it is starting to molt into its alternate plumage, but it's still mostly in basic plumage. And then the bird on the right is a female. And you can tell the females because they have that dark horizontal brown stripe right through the middle of their face. And they look like that pretty much all year round. So there's one of the exceptions to the eclipse plumage stuff that we talked about. Okay, and then the very last picture I have is I had a really cool opportunity. It was almost exactly a year ago. I think it was November 7th of last year. There was a king eider reported in Bemidji, and it's a 3.5-hour drive one way. And I said to Margie, you know, king eider would be a life bird for me. I mean, not just a Minnesota state bird. I've never seen a king eider before. And so I left that morning, like about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I got up to Bemidji around 10, and I spent a couple hours at Lake Bemidji and then turned around and drove home. But in this picture, the first thing that was up there that was cool is all 3 scoter species were there, and they were all at one point in the same binocular view. So there was surf scoter, black scoter, and white wing scoter all together, which was cool. And this particular picture, that's a white wing scoter on the far left. And then right next to it is the king eider. And then the white duck on the right is a long-tailed duck. So those are all birds that I know we didn't talk about tonight because they're not probably something you're going to see very often. But that was a waterfowl bonanza day for me. So anybody have questions?
Rick, are you seeing some waterfowl movement through your part of the country?
You know, it hasn't really. Yes, we are. There is some waterfowl movement. And I don't know what it's like in Nebraska, but my guess would be that because it hasn't been super cold yet, that we probably haven't seen the major hit of it yet. You know, the songbirds migrate, their migration, you know, migration is always all about habitat, you know, finding what the birds need. So the warblers and the vireos, you know, they have to go south when the insects die because they have to eat insects. But waterfowl is a little bit different because they don't need to migrate until the water freezes, because their habitat is, they get their food, they get their shelter, they get, you know, their water, everything they need in the water that they live in. So really the waterfowl migration is more driven by the weather than the songbird migration is. So I would guess that, you know, probably there's some Arctic air mass that's supposed to move out of Canada the next few days, or move into Canada the next few days. And I would guess that's probably going to push some waterfowl our way.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Well, thanks everybody for attending. It's always a pleasure to see all of you, and it's always a pleasure to do these programs. I hope I didn't overdo it, but I think we've met the 1 hour time goal. So
I really do appreciate this, Rick. It's really, really nice to have these ID programs, especially as timely as they are. And thank you very much. Next month, we do have a program in place, and it's a graduate student working with Joel Jorgensen at Game and Parks, and he's going to speak about some basic research. So he's a young man. Everybody be really, really nice and show up, and we'll not scare him too badly. So, but we really do appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody coming in and for this. And we hope we'll see you next month. And I'll have some programs for you that'll go into the ASO Meadowlark for January and February. I appreciated with Mary. I liked the talk about molts. I had no idea. So thank you.
You're welcome.